Welcome, everyone. Good afternoon, good evening, good morning around the world. My name is David Sandelow. I am the inaugural fellow at the Center on Global Energy Policy and the chair of the ICEF Innovation Roadmap project. Today, we're going to talk about the latest roadmap released by ICEF on the topic of low carbon ammonia and how it can help fight climate change. This event is being webcast live. The full video is going to be available online in the coming days. And here's the plan. We have a number of co-authors of this roadmap with us today. We're going to present a PowerPoint deck that explains the content of what we've written. Then we're going to have a dialogue among us, and then we're going to throw it open to you, the audience, for questions. So if you have questions, you can submit them in the Q&A box at the bottom of your Zoom screen. And now it's my great pleasure to introduce my friends and co-authors who've helped prepare this roadmap. In alphabetical order, we have Fan Jiwan, who is a PhD student and research associate at Columbia University. Dr. Julio Friedman, chief scientist and chief carbon wrangler at Carbon Direct and an alumni of the Center on Global Energy Policy. Dr. Colin McCormick, principal scientist at Carbon Direct and a professor at Georgetown University. And Ann Catherine Mers, an industry analyst at First Ammonia and a research assistant at the Center on Global Energy Policy. And so with that, we will load up PowerPoint deck and get started. And thank you, Julio, for loading PowerPoint, which we're not seeing yet, but I bet it's coming. There it goes. Maybe back a couple of pages if you can. Well, we can start here. This is a this slide shows the innovation roadmaps that have been done in about the past 7 years. This is actually the 10th ICEF roadmap that's just been completed. And can you go to the next slide? We've gotten actually there's been some very generous comments about these ICEF innovation roadmaps. This is a statement by Ho-Sung Lee, who's the chair of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. He wrote, "The ICEF roadmaps provide important research on a wide range of technologies for helping achieve net zero emissions. They're an important resource for anyone working on these issues." Next one. Our colleague Alyssa Park at Columbia wrote, "The ICEF roadmaps are an excellent resource for researchers and practitioners cross-disciplinary boundaries to develop transformative solutions for climate change." And next one. And let's see. And Vaclav Smil, who's one of the world's leading energy historians, also had some kind words to say about the roadmap, saying they provide essential information on different aspects of our energy systems and how they change over time. Next slide.
It seems like we may be having some difficulties with Dr. Sandelow calling in from Abu Dhabi. So until he is back in full, please allow me to step in and continue with the presentation around the roadmap. This is a joint effort by many people, and as Dr. Sandelow said at the beginning, we do this every year. Love doing this effort, and we do it in partnership with the government of Japan, with the Ministry of Energy, Technology and Infrastructure, METI, as well as NIDO, which is their research directorate. We're going to start with real basics. What is ammonia? Why do you care? Ammonia is, in fact, the only reason we have as many people on Earth as we do. It feeds the world. It is a central building block to modern agriculture because it is the key component of nitrogen fertilizers. Without it, about 80% of the people in the world would not have enough food. It is also an important feedstock for everything from explosives to chemicals to plastics to rubber. It is in fact a core agent of civilization. It is also the case that we are interested in it these days because, in fact, it is a fuel as well. It's not just something that you keep under your sink to clean things up. It is, in fact, a fuel, and it is a fuel similar in many ways to propane. It is an odorless gas. It is a colorless gas, but boy, it smells strong. You smell ammonia, you know it. It has the same basic pressure and temperature constraints as propane. It freezes, it liquefies at about -33°C and something like 25 bars of pressure. It is about half the energy density of LNG, but in fact, it has a lot of energy in it. It's a little harder to ignite than gas or gasoline, but you can in fact burn it in many different applications or run it through a fuel cell to generate electricity. It is important to note, because it is so important in fertilizer and in the actual world today, ammonia is extensively regulated. It is regulated around the world, mostly for safety because of the concerns about toxicity and environmental harm. But in fact, we use it widely and it is shipped all over the world. In that context, we make a lot of it. About 2% of global greenhouse gas emissions come from making ammonia. That is about the same as global shipping. It's about the same as aviation. And most of those emissions come from making hydrogen, which is one of the core ingredients. Most of that comes from methane or coal. We'll be talking more about the way that hydrogen and ammonia are produced shortly. It is important to note that because of this huge volume, again, we move about 180 million tons of ammonia every year. And so it is a large volume that goes through our economy. To talk about the production of clean ammonia, low carbon ammonia, I'm going to hand this over to Ann-Katrin Meres.
Hi, everyone. It's great to be here today. So yeah, what are our options for making ammonia low carbon? So what's important to understand is, since we have this large system of ammonia being produced today, the plants that exist have very long lifetimes, on average 50 years. And while the average plant age in Europe is about 40 years, so nearing the end of the lifetime, in places like China, we have an average plant age of 12 years, meaning 12 out of 50 years, these plants are still going to be producing far into the future. And so one of the primary ways to turn the existing ammonia low carbon is by adding carbon capture and storage, so that we capture the carbon from the production process and either store it underground or in long-lived processes and long-lived products. And this is often called blue ammonia. Then the other option for decarbonizing ammonia, and this is most relevant for new build plants, is to create ammonia from clean electricity by using clean electricity to separate hydrogen from a water molecule, and then taking nitrogen from the air to then create ammonia. And here it's important to note that this green ammonia is only as green as the electricity source used. So the cleaner the electricity, the cleaner the ammonia production process. And a final option that we want to highlight today is the fact that ammonia can also be produced from biomass. And the ideal scenario would be to produce ammonia from waste feedstocks, so from agricultural waste or municipal waste, and then you would be eliminating the emissions that you would have from this waste decomposing and creating something useful. Now, moving on to the next slide, we have these broad categories of blue ammonia, green ammonia, ammonia from biomass, but these are broad categories, but there's substantial variation in the amount of carbon emissions within these categories. So much so that some people propose abandoning the terms, something we'll talk about more later, I'm sure. And so to understand what this variation in emissions means, let me share this graph with you. And brace yourself, this part can get a little more technical. So looking at this graph, we see the carbon emissions from hydrogen production. We're using hydrogen as a proxy for ammonia, since the hydrogen production step is 90% of the emissions that are released. We simply have better data on hydrogen since it's been studied more. So on the y-axis, you see how much carbon dioxide is produced per kilogram of hydrogen produced. And then on the bottom, on the x-axis, you see the various ammonia production methods. Now, on the far left, you'll see the dirtiest production method, which is hydrogen and ammonia produced from coal. And unfortunately, this is still widespread and will be widespread given that it's the predominant method in places like China. From there, the next two bars, you see the green bars, could technically be called green ammonia because you're using green electricity. Well, because you're using electricity, but to clarify, it's not really green if you're using just the existing US electricity grid, which is still fossil fuel based. Our goal when we go talk about clean ammonia is to get to that little dot on the far right, the electrolysis with 100% zero carbon electricity, because only in that instance, when you are using really zero carbon electricity, can you talk about creating zero carbon hydrogen and zero carbon ammonia. Next, looking at the gray bars, we have more conventional ammonia production method from natural gas. And again, we can take these existing methods to be low carbon by adding carbon capture and storage. And again, you'll notice that there's variation depending on the carbon capture technology that is used. Then finally, on the far right, we have negative emissions from ammonia produced from biomass. And here we're modeling a best case scenario where you have biomass that is then absorbing carbon dioxide from the atmosphere as it is growing. And then during the production stage, you would use carbon capture to capture the emissions. And here I should owe a shout out to our colleagues at the center, Anne-Sophie Corbeau and Yushan Liu, who just released an awesome paper on hydrogen from biomass that I encourage everyone to read. So in short, you look at this graph, you see there's a lot of variation in emissions levels, depending on the technology and the energy sources used. The next thing to consider is, of course, the question of cost. And here, the smallest bar that you'll see on this image, and on these graphs showing the cost of ammonia production methods, the lowest cost is still steam methane reforming from natural gas. And then when we add carbon and capture, you'll see the blue bars. So the cost goes up a little bit. Green ammonia production still has, which is shown in the green bars on the far right, is still substantially more expensive. But I have two key takeaways for you here. The first is that the cost of green ammonia production is going to drop dramatically because we're using these electrolyzers, which are modularized technologies where there is tremendous efforts in both R&D and in driving out deployment, where we expect to see substantial cost declines in the future. This gap between conventional ammonia production cost and the cleaner production methods is also narrowing in part because of the volatility that we've seen in natural gas prices in the last 2 years. So where in the last 20 years, natural gas prices were between $100 to $600 per ton, in 2021, we hit over $1,000 per ton around the world. And as I'm sure last year, we even hit over $1,500 per ton in some regions. And since in conventional ammonia production, natural gas is one of the primary feedstocks, this volatility in natural gas prices results in volatility in ammonia prices. And being one of the primary inputs in fertilizer, this means that natural gas and ammonia prices are tied to each other, as are fertilizer prices. An important topic that my colleague here at the Energy Center, Fan, who's one of the foremost experts on this topic, will explain further as we talk about the uses of ammonia.
Thank you so much, Anne-Catherine, for the detailed explanation about how to make and what are the properties are about the low carbon ammonia productions. So the next question is, why should we care? What does low carbon ammonia do? How could it help us to help with the fighting against climate change? So the very first intuitive solution is that low carbon ammonia can be a drop-in replacement for the ammonia that's already been produced. As we mentioned, ammonia production is contributing to around 2% of the global CO2 equivalent emissions. If we can replace the fossil ammonias with low carbon ammonia, such as blue and green ammonia, we can directly make a very good benefit for the climate. We don't need a lot of new infrastructures for ammonia replace the fertilizers. We can use the equipments of transportation, storage, and conversion for other fertilizers just existing today. We just need a minor tweak about how to ship and how to produce the ammonia in the low carbon way. So this is a low hanging fruit about how ammonia can help fighting against the climate change. Moving to the next slide, please. Ammonia can not just being used as a fertilizer or chemical feedstocks. It can also, as we mentioned, a very strong low carbon fuel alternative source. So low carbon ammonia can be used for shipping, heavy industries, and power sectors to provide significant emission reductions to replace the current fossil fuels such as shipping bunker fuels, coal and natural gas being used in turbines, in furnaces, etc. But in this case, ammonia replacement to other kinds of fuel will not be a drop-in replacement, just as it's being for the agriculture sectors. There will be a lot of technical changes, for example, replacing the engines, replacing the fuel tanks, and some standards will be set up. So there will be a lot of progress to be made for low carbon ammonia to be used as an energy source in the future. And in order to do that, moving to the next slide, please. A lot of technology innovations will definitely need to be made. Ammonia can be combusted in turbines, boilers, engines, and furnaces, but those technologies are currently either in research and development or in pilot scale. So for them to be commercially available, there's still a relatively long way to go comparing with agriculture sectors. We need to study very carefully about how ammonia co-combustions or co-firing with other fuels such as diesels or natural gas. We need to figure out how ammonia combustions in the industrial sectors could change its application and chemical processes. And we need to figure out what are the best way to integrate ammonia applications into these well-established facilities, because originally those facilities are well-established and very optimized. So in short, we definitely need a lot of research and development and demonstration pilot projects for ammonia to be used in a lot of energy sectors, but those things are not quite far away from there. We're already seeing that in countries like Japan, ammonia co-combustion is being demonstrated in a relatively high percentage in boilers, turbines, and engines. So a great amount of improvement in these technologies can definitely help a lot in terms of fighting against global climate change in other sectors as well.
With that, allow me to speak a little bit about the challenges associated with infrastructure for clean ammonia. Ammonia is not LNG or propane or gas. It is not natural gas. It is not hydrogen. It is its own thing. And that means it needs special infrastructure to deliver to the markets. That will require substantial capital investments. Just to give you a sense, a very large ammonia export terminal, say 1.25 million tons a year, just the storage tanks will cost $500 million a year. I mean, total. It's a lot of money. In doing this report, we were surprised to see how much existing infrastructure there is around the world today. There's over 200 import and export terminals that is used mostly to move ammonia around the world for fertilizer production. In the United States alone, there are 10,000 miles of ammonia pipelines. This was a big surprise. Most people don't know this. So that infrastructure exists, but we need a whole lot more of it. We will need, in particular, ports, not only for the shipment of ammonia to places, but also to fuel ships with bunkering facilities and associated storage. One of the things we discovered is that it is possible with modest cost on the order of 10 to 15% additional cost to retrofit an LNG terminal to become an ammonia terminal. That's important in terms of thinking about things like managing lock-in from fossil fuel construction. So it is possible to change some kinds of infrastructure, but it is not turnkey. You have to actually do the work and spend the money to get that done. We took the issues of healthcare and safety very seriously. This work was mostly done by Corinne Scone at LBL, Lawrence Berkeley National Lab, but I'm happy to hand this over to Colin McCormick to speak about these issues.
Thank you, Julio. So before we can get too excited about the decarbonization potential of low carbon ammonia, it is, of course, crucial to think about the health and safety and environmental implications of ammonia use. As you've heard earlier in the presentation, ammonia already is in widespread industrial use, 180 million tons manufactured last year. That means that we have decades of experience in safe industrial use in certain applications of ammonia. So very broadly, when we look at adopting low carbon ammonia as a drop-in replacement to applications such as fertilizer, we conclude that that broadly does not alter risks. One-for-one substitution, the ammonia is chemically identical regardless of its production method. That said, as we look at the adoption of low carbon ammonia in new applications, that could alter risk profiles, and we focused our attention on that. So let's move forward to the next slide. There are some advantages that suggest that broadly health and safety issues for ammonia are, while real, are indeed minimized, can be minimized and can be manageable. We'll start with flammability. Ammonia has a relatively narrow flammability concentration range in air. It takes a higher concentration to become flammable than methane. And in fact, the upper flammability limit is relatively low. That's an advantage when dealing with potential flammability concerns. It turns out to be a disadvantage when trying to design combustion systems. We'll come back to that in a moment. Ammonia also smells. Anyone who has been in a kitchen with cleaning agent knows that. It is detectable by human noses at relatively low concentrations, 1 to 5 parts per million. That is well below the concentrations at which harm occurs. Irritation of eyes and the throat sets in perhaps 100 times higher than that in concentrations. So that means it has a self-alarming property. If there are ammonia leaks in the presence of human staff, they are detected. And in fact, the intensity of the smell increases with the concentration. So broadly, that points to the top priority of avoiding large uncontrolled releases. Those have occurred in industrial settings, in refrigerant charging, discharging, in some cases, transport accidents. But this remains a key focus, and industrial best practices are absolutely crucial in minimizing this. In addition to those immediate impacts, there are also impacts on local air quality, particularly around particulate formation and in water quality, where eutrophication is a key concern. There are some conclusions we were able to draw from existing known science on this, but there remain many open questions about the fate and transport of ammonia in air and in water. We'll speak to these in the R&D section later, but in particular, interaction of ammonia with NOx and SOx is of concern in the lower tropospheres for particulate formation and may have implications, although they're very poorly understood, for climate in the upper troposphere. Water quality is also of concern. There has been very limited research on this. Some recent efforts to think through what ammonia spills might mean. They will be different than other marine gas, oil, or fuel spills, but that deserves a significant amount of research attention. Let's move to the next slide. So as we move on to R&D priorities, this integrates all of the previous sections we've talked about, and these we distilled out as key focus areas, beginning with production. That we need improved methods to deeply integrate renewable energy, particularly variable renewable energy, especially in situations where those resources may be far from where the energy, ammonia, is consumed. We see a number of ammonia projects that are near variable resources globally, but the points of consumption may be quite distant from that. In green ammonia, we've heard earlier about likely cost reductions. Those will focus on increasing life cycle energy efficiency and driving down the capital intensity that's required. When it comes to blue ammonia, there are multiple sources of CO2 that are released from standard blue ammonia. Production increasing the net CO2 capture to drive above that 90% capture that was indicated earlier will be key to driving down CO2 intensity for blue ammonia. Novel uses, we've spoken about that. That will include engineering and design for new combustion and new conversion technologies, or improved and refined versions. Managing remaining environmental and safety risks, particularly around air and water risks, will be key. And understanding more broadly, more holistically, life cycle energy and climate impacts will also be key. Let's move on from there. And I'll turn it back to David.
David, we see you. Are you there?
Hi, everybody. Sorry about the connection problems earlier. Are you hearing me now? I am here. Okay, take it away. Maybe take it away, Julio. Yeah.
As you wish. Thank you. We're sorry for your difficulties. We look forward to your comments coming shortly. In order to get these to market, cost remains an issue, as Anne-Catherine mentioned. And so policy is important. Same thing for the infrastructure. Policy is important. In that context, the policy landscape is moving very, very quickly. Japan is leading in this arena, chiefly not only through industrial policy to make devices that produce and use green and blue ammonia, but also by buying a lot of it. Japan has made a hard policy decision that they will use green ammonia to generate power and for industrial decarbonization in their own country, and they are building ships to help make that occur. They are moving very quickly and very profoundly in this space. They are certainly not alone. Many of you will be aware of the tax incentives created by the Inflation Reduction Act in the US. These are matched also with things like the hydrogen hub system from the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act the year before. These incentives are creating a boom for green hydrogen, and blue and green ammonia production in the US. Not to be outdone, the European Union has strong incentives, particularly for green hydrogen and green ammonia production, and they are looking for ways to bring ammonia into their system urgently, in part as a response to the war of Russian aggression in the Ukraine. Adding to that, many other nations are investing in research and development. Many are looking to incentivize production. In our own work, we looked at a number of nations that were moving in this direction. Importantly, the global south is moving quickly. Nations like Chile, Namibia, India, Indonesia, Vietnam, and Malaysia are moving quickly to produce green and blue hydrogen to make green and blue ammonia. Also, not to be outdone, many Middle Eastern nations, notably the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and Qatar, are all making big advances in this direction. But we've even seen recent announcements in Egypt for large green hydrogen and green ammonia projects. So buckle up, folks. It's going to be an interesting couple of years in the policy arena. Based on what I just described, we are seeing a mix of policies. Demand side policies are the fewest out there. There's a lot of supply policy, but not as much demand policy. To true up the market, we would need to see both of these. One potential example could be something like the Farm Bill coming up this year in the United States. Other examples are possible, for example, to purchase low carbon ammonia for industrial use in some place like Singapore or Korea. In addition to that, the regulations will also need to be followed, and we need to strengthen those regulations to make sure that the health and safety issues are carried and that the environmental consequences are minimized. We believe that there's a lot of focus on hydrogen in national programs, not as much in ammonia. And as we said before, these are different things. So we would like to see more nations get involved in having ammonia policies as opposed to just hydrogen policies. It is also important to say that we do not believe that ammonia will be good for everything everywhere. Each nation should think carefully about how ammonia can serve its decarbonization and industrialization goals. We don't think, for example, that most countries will use ammonia for power generation the way that a country like Japan or Korea might, but they may very well want to have secure low carbon fertilizer supply, or they may want to think about it for their own industrial use or for maritime use. Each nation and individual companies should assess the cost of production and use versus other decarbonization strategies. And many economies, other decarbonization strategies will be cheaper and easier to implement. With that, I'm going to hand it back to Dr. McCormick to discuss the findings, and I'll close with recommendations.
Thank you, Julio. So our first finding is that low carbon ammonia could produce significant greenhouse gas reductions in key sectors this decade and deep reductions in additional sectors by 2050. We'll move ahead. Second finding, there are no technical barriers to producing low carbon ammonia in large volume before 2030. This is not about cost. Finding 3 is cost is the chief barrier to deployment. We've spoken briefly about cost trajectories of different technologies, and we're happy to speak more about that during Q&A. Number 4, the environmental risks. The environmental risks from ammonia scale-up and use appear to be modest and manageable. That also includes human health and safety risks. We don't want to underplay the fact that these risks do exist, but we believe that existing knowledge about safe handling of ammonia and a robust R&D agenda can certainly manage these risks. Next slide. Number 5, global low carbon ammonia trade will require infrastructure investment and more ships. A key point here is compared to hydrogen trade, ammonia infrastructure to handle and transport is significantly more advanced. However, large investment is still required in this infrastructure. Number 6, before low carbon ammonia can deliver substantial abatement, more work on applications is a priority. That includes development of combustion and other conversion technologies that are different and that face different challenges from using ammonia from other fuels. Finding 7, very few countries do have policies that support low carbon ammonia today. That may change in 2023, but we see that as the current status. Next slide.
So from these findings, we have sets of recommendations. First and foremost, governments should provide policies that help support the production of low carbon ammonia. The supply is an important thing, and we need more of that to hit the climate goals, which we think are important. Because of the relative low maturity of use for ammonia, we need to put a lot more investment into innovation for low carbon ammonia use. In between the production and use, we need to launch public-private partnerships to help develop the infrastructure to get the ammonia from where it's made today and in the future to where it can be used effectively. Because all of this is about carbon attributes, we need to have an international certification system that focuses on the carbon attributes. We need standards that can be developed, especially where ammonia is used for a fuel. In those cases, we really want to make sure that low carbon in yields low carbon out. Finally, businesses, governments should support a lot of data gathering. If you have received nothing else from today's talk, these are very early days on every front. We don't know as much about risks of leakage. We don't know much about consequence when ammonia enters the environment. We don't know as much as we'd like to about combustion, either about its efficacy or its risks. We don't know as much about the potential to use it in new applications and so forth. This is a terrific opportunity to gather data and to use that data to build sound regulations that can avoid poor outcomes. Last but not least, policy incentives are necessary to bring low carbon ammonia to market. This should not be based on the production method. It should be about the carbon intensity. We like to take a colorblind approach here. It's not the color or production method, it is the carbon intensity of production. As Anne-Catherine showed earlier, you can make green hydrogen with a high carbon footprint or a low carbon footprint. You can make blue hydrogen with a high carbon footprint or a low carbon footprint. The goal should not be anything other than just getting the lowest carbon footprint possible to use for these decarbonization applications, whether is it in fertilizer or whether it is in new applications like maritime industry or power. In the roadmap, we have detailed descriptions for what to do for production, for applied technology, for transport, for health and safety, and for policy. Each of these has a near-term, mid-term, and long-term set of recommendations. In that context, we encourage you to go to the ICEF Roadmap's website. We will be posting the link in the chat shortly so that you can go there yourself, download the report, and learn more about this fascinating subject. with that, I'm going to see if our colleague David is able to join us again, at least by sound, if not some other way. David, are you there?
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Tremendous. Can you hear me? Give me a thumbs up. Great. My apologies for the connections, everybody. I'm in a major hotel. I'm very surprised that this is happening, but this tremendous presentation. And let me just start by asking about a topic which a lot of people are talking about in the United States right now, the Inflation Reduction Act, and what the implications are of that law for low carbon ammonia. It's obviously, been called the most important climate legislation ever passed, many clean energy provisions. Julio, what your thoughts on that?
Thank you, David, and happy to discuss. This is in fact a watershed moment. Oh, you're going to have to mute there. Thank you, David. This is a watershed moment for policy in the United States. As I said before, the IRA and also the IIJA, the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, both play a huge role now. In the IIJA, in part, things like the hydrogen hubs, $8 billion for as many as 10 hubs, are focused on the creation and use of low carbon ammonia. I mean, of low carbon hydrogen. That includes for low carbon ammonia products like fertilizer or for shipping overseas. In addition to that, there are these new strong incentives that are keyed to carbon footprint. That specifically they say if you can get below a certain threshold, we will give you $3 a kilogram if your carbon intensity is super low. Mostly that will benefit things like green hydrogen production using variable renewables or low carbon electricity, say from nuclear or hydro, but it will also make possible things like biohydrogen that is extra low carbon, and the very best fossil projects could qualify. That incentive is large enough to actually be a world beater. And in fact, as part of the policy discussions, we are already seeing nations around the world rather gritting their teeth. And they had planned their own green hydrogen productions, and now all the electrolyzers are getting shipped to the United States. This policy landscape is dynamic, but the IRA has really changed the way that people are thinking about the production of clean hydrogen and clean ammonia in the US.
Julio, your answer, you just emphasized the production incentives in the IRA and their supply incentives in places. What do we do are there incentives right now to increase demand for low carbon ammonia? And any thoughts on how we do that? Colin, did you want to come in on that or the prior question?
I do want to add one comment to the prior question. Julio is absolutely correct about his key macro points here. There are some open policy questions. We're waiting to see some specifics of how the IRS is going to implement, particularly 45J, and particularly how that might impact electrolytic hydrogen production. So watch this space. IRA set a tremendously powerful and valuable footprint, but as always, there are the devil's in the policy details, and it will be extremely interesting and important to watch how that unfolds when IRS publishes its regs.
Right. In that context, with respect to use, there is very little in the IRA that supports use. There are credits to provide things like cheap electrolyzer productions and so forth, but we are not yet at the point where things like we are seeing demand for ammonia and steel use or for shipping or these other things. There is some money in the IIJA for port upgrades, $17 billion to upgrade ports. Some of that may go to ammonia. It is also important to say that in addition to 45J and 45V, 45V being the clean hydrogen production tax credit, the 45Q tax credits for carbon capture are large enough that they will start by decarbonizing a lot of the existing plants in the US. And we are already seeing a lot of new blue ammonia facilities being built around the country in response to those incentives. So you cannot stack both the 45V and the 45Q incentives. You have to choose one or the other. The incentives are large enough to get both green ammonia and blue ammonia up and running. What I would like to see, David, to your question, I'd love to see something in the Farm Bill. The first use for fertilizer. That's how we use ammonia today. Most of the hydrogen made in the US goes to ammonia production for fertilizer. If we could create an incentive to use green fertilizer in the United States, that would actually send a strong signal for ammonia production and use.
Great. One thing I've learned working on this topic for the past year is there's a big public acceptance issue, or at least one that I keep encountering. People are concerned about ammonia. It smells bad, as we've already said. It's sometimes inaccurately associated with the explosives in ways that aren't quite right. Any thoughts about public acceptance and what can be done on that?
A couple of quick thoughts. We actually have a question in the Q&A about not just the health and safety issues, but other environmental issues. I want to get to those after this question. Most people don't know what we're talking about when we're talking about ammonia. They barely know that it's under their sink. They barely know that we use it for fertilizer. They don't know that it is made today in public waste management systems and managed already. They don't know that OSHA has very strong rules in terms of its safety and operation. It is also the experience that even if people know that, they don't necessarily care. They are reasonably concerned about the impacts to disadvantaged communities. They are reasonably concerned about spills and how those will affect everything from local wildlife to greenhouse gases. I think it's important to get ahead of these topics and make sure that we lead with facts and we are actively gathering information to be able to set strong regulations. I would also say, though, to your question, David, we've learned from doing this research in this study that because we move 180 million tons of ammonia today, this is manageable. We already make a lot of ammonia, we already move a lot of ammonia. So it's not like a lot of other technologies where we're starting to scale up a whole new thing. We have this huge dedicated safety and infrastructure system, and that's a good place to start discussions with the public.
And if I may jump in here, despite these safety concerns, it's important to realize that how much ammonia we're already producing today, and that this ammonia is being produced from natural gas and from coal. And especially given as the global population continues to rise and we continue to need more fertilizer in the future, there's no question that we have to decarbonize and make the existing ammonia production low carbon.
There are so many questions in the chat, right, that we've gotten in and Q&A, and we're only going to be able to touch on some of them, but let me just pick up a few. Ed Weinberg asked an interesting question about is anyone looking at low carbon ammonia used for NOx emissions reduction at power plants? So
it's important. Yeah, why don't I start briefly? We already use ammonia for NOx control. Most people don't. We actually use ammonia today to reduce nitrous oxides emissions. And so it is both a risk in which we might create more nitrous oxide production through combustion, but it is also the way in which we manage it today. So this ends up being a complicated space. And again, part of the reason we think it's sound to do more research. Colin and Fan, anything you want to add to that?
I'll make one comment, which is this emphasizes the challenges that remain in particularly combusting ammonia. It is combustion done wrong will generate NOx. Combustion systems designed right can minimize that and can also have NOx scrubbers appended to them. That will be crucial to focus on going forward as we look to these combustion applications. And maybe Fan wants to mention something on that as well.
Yeah, just as we mentioned before, like considering the whole ammonia supply chain, that from the production side and the transportation side and storage side, we actually have a very good history and good standard about how to manage that. It is actually the new application side as being the most uncertainties lies upon. So in terms of how we combust ammonia in the turbines, how we prevent excessive NOx emissions, how do we prevent ammonia sleep, such as ammonia is not fully combusted and directly leaked to the air. Those are the things that the technologies are not well established, that the uncertainties really lies upon. So that is the real R&D resources should be allocated to. In terms of the previous steps like transportation, storage, and production side, we actually have a very good system already established.
We have a number of questions about cost. There's a question from Jeff Brown about cost on storage and comparing, how do we think about this particularly compared with battery storage? Does anybody want to take up cost issues broadly?
Right, so let's start by saying if you have a whole bunch of cheap renewable electricity, you probably want to use it as cheap renewable electricity first. The best application for that stuff is often decarbonizing the grid. A lot of what we're talking about for ammonia is important to know in the cost structure is that this is for often very hard to abate applications. And so we're looking into systems where other systems are very, very expensive. For blue ammonia, cost is chiefly a function of the fuel of natural gas and can you store the CO2? If you cannot store the CO2, you got nothing. If you can, it's actually a very cheap way to do it, provided the natural gas is not too expensive. It is also the case with green, the primary cost is the cost of electricity. If you have low carbon, low cost electricity, you're in business. If not, it's going to be blown out of the water by other options. As a storage option, to Jeff's specific question, can you use it to store energy? The answer, of course, is yes. This ends up being very application and geography specific. So if you, for example, can store hydrogen in a salt cavern, as we're thinking about doing in the United States, that is in fact cheaper than storing ammonia because you don't have to make the ammonia. So hydrogen storage is in fact in those systems way cheaper than batteries and way cheaper than ammonia. In a place like Singapore or Japan where you don't have that option, storage of hydrogen is going to actually, storage of ammonia is actually going to be cheaper than many other options. However, if you are in a place where you have abundant low-cost electricity and you want to turn it back into electricity, in many cases, the battery costs are dropping fast. And especially for 4 or 8 hour kind of applications, the batteries are just going to win. So it really depends on what you're using it for and what the competition is, just like everything else.
And ammonia really has an advantage over, say, battery storage when it comes to long-term energy storage. So that's why, besides just stationary long-term energy storage for the electricity system, ammonia is also most likely to be one of the fuels for the shipping industry in the future. As mentioned, the shipping industry is 2% of global emissions. These ships travel massive distances and need an incredible amount of energy. Batteries simply do not have the energy density to be able to power these ships. And so that's a situation then where ammonia, being more energy dense, is going to be the more likely fuel source.
This may be a good point to mention also, as we look at green hydrogen export projects around the world, we increasingly see them considering converting hydrogen to ammonia for maritime transport, and then either cracking it on the far end or delivering it and using it as ammonia. So this is the transport advantages over hydrogen are worth discussing. Julio wants to mention something on that.
Yeah, that is, again, back to the cost question, very important. To make low cost ammonia, you either need really low cost gas or you need really low cost electricity. A lot of places in the developing South have these things. So you can see super low cost blue ammonia being made in Nigeria, super low cost green ammonia being made in Chile and Namibia and India. If they want to export those beyond their own use, they're going to export it as ammonia, not as hydrogen.
Do you think that means there could be some geopolitical implications from the development of this industry, Julio?
Oh, yes. In fact, there already are. Japan has put together over 30 bilaterals for production of low carbon ammonia and for its use. We are seeing the rise of renewable resource nations as potential geopolitical players. It is also the case that the Gulf states are repurposing their own existing products towards a low carbon world. So one of the biggest green ammonia projects is in Western Saudi Arabia. One of the biggest blue ammonia projects is in Eastern Saudi Arabia and Qatar. And so we are seeing a realignment of these things in terms of new supplies in ways that might in the near term strengthen petrostates, but in the long term may disrupt cartels and lead to whole new supply systems.
We have a number of questions that really go to kind of what's happening out there right now. Taylor, I think, asked about what's happening in the shipping industry. How much interest is there in the shipping industry right now? And we have another question about just how many pipelines are out there right now for ammonia. So some thoughts on that, maybe. And Catherine, I know you're pretty close to this. Any thoughts on what's happening in the shipping industry today?
Yeah, so the shipping industry is really interesting from a decarbonization perspective. Basically, the problem we have is the fact that it is 2% of global emissions, but we don't have a clear winner for how we're going to decarbonize the sector in the future. What we expect to see most likely is a multi-fuel future where we'll be using different fuels. Right now, there's a lot of discussion in the shipping industry about methanol, simply because the infrastructure for methanol is already there. But as many know, one of the problems with methanol is that it has a carbon molecule. So it can only be really considered a low carbon fuel if that carbon molecule is captured using carbon capture, meaning that you're already taking a carbon molecule out of the atmosphere. In the long term, as we have more infrastructure build up, it is very likely that ammonia is going to be the shipping fuel of choice. As my colleagues mentioned, there are several companies that are working on combustion engines for ammonia combustion for shipping. And further in the future, we'll most likely be moving to fuel cells, which are even more efficient. In any case, we see a complicated scenario where there is a high demand, a high need for more infrastructure, and the need for collaboration across the entire value chain, where a shipping company is only going to want to invest in a ship and take on that massive capital expenditure. And then if they know that the fuel for that ship is going to be available at the ports across the world, so that they can, of course, run the ship. And so being a risk-averse sector, this is going to be one of the spaces where we're going to need more policy support to help demand get that initial uptake.
Bon, any this from your standpoint?
Yeah, definitely. First of all, as Anne-Catherine just said, that there's definitely a technical barrier over there. We definitely need a lot more technical advancement about shipping engines and etc. and infrastructure support. Another thing about shipping industry is that it's curiously an international nature. So the ship is traveling around the world. So low carbon ammonia supply is currently a very big barrier. So it is possible that the ships can drop down at one point that has low carbon ammonia fueling, but in another point there is only ammonia, but not guaranteed to be low carbon. So in terms of how to demonstrate internationally well-organized low carbon ammonia support is critical to drive its own demand.
Just two quick things to add to that, David. First of all, as Fan was saying, shipping industries are trying to figure out specific routes. As Anne-Catherine said, they are looking at between methanol and ammonia as key fuels. A lot of these companies are doing a try before you buy strategy. They are basically putting individual green corridors in place, say between Shanghai and Los Angeles, and saying, we're going to put the infrastructure and the fueling we need there, see how it works. Based on that, we'll think about the larger question of future investments. And that gives them a chance to gather data before they make large investment decisions. The other thing is they are looking both at using ammonia today in their existing fuel sets, as well as pivoting to new engines that are driven by fuel cells. Ultimately, if we can get to a place where we are not burning ammonia at all, we're just using it, we will double the fuel efficiency of the ammonia just by moving to fuel cells, and we will zero out the emissions footprint. The challenge is that we don't have the fuel cell stack production we would like today, so you just can't go out and buy these ships. So there's going to be a stepwise transition, both in terms spatially, as you get a couple of routes going and then you build more routes, as well as a stepwise transition for the ships themselves.
And one more thing I'd like to emphasize here is just how the massive quantities of ammonia we're talking about. So not only do we have to decarbonize the existing ammonia that is used for fertilizer, but if there's going to be real uptake in the shipping industry, we're going to have to be producing millions more tons of ammonia as well. And some of the early front runners in the shipping industry are already working on testing innovative engines, but are finding that it's hard to find low carbon ammonia or low carbon hydrogen for their engines. All of which speaks to the fact that more than anything, we have to get started on the production side. The variety of offtakes are going to be developing in the future.
Juan Camelia Farfan, our star student at SEPA, has an interesting question about the Haber-Bosch process and whether there's any changes coming with variable renewables in the Haber-Bosch process potentially that might affect this industry. And any thoughts on that?
That's Colin's favorite topic, and Fan's too. Go ahead, Fan.
Yeah, so maybe just quickly about the Haber-Bosch process itself, it's been well established for 100 years. In terms of the current production process, no matter if it's blue hydrogen or green hydrogen or the source of hydrogen, it's all going to the same Haber-Bosch process, and Haber-Bosch process itself is colorblind. It doesn't matter what the hydrogen source is. In terms of the long-term future, how could we replace the Haber-Bosch process totally? For example, someone mentioned that it's possible to have new catalysts or new technologies in the future that we can synthesize ammonia directly from water and nitrogen. That will be a directly new area about research and applications. Currently speaking, the Haber-Bosch process is not the overwhelmingly majority of the production. It is the only production of ammonia in the current stage and in the short-term future. We're keen to see the development in the technologies about novel production methods in the future, but unfortunately, it's not likely to happen in the next 5 to 10 years.
As we close up and we're almost at the end, I wonder, any thoughts about what we don't know about ammonia? What do we need to know to scale up this industry? I got your hand was up first, Julio. So Julio, then Colin.
I wanted to use this opportunity to go back to one of the questions that was raised about what happens in the environment with things like, if we drop ammonia into the ocean, what happens? If we emit ammonia into the air, what happens? And the answer is we know a whole lot less than we think we would know. Right now, if ammonia goes into the air, we don't know if that makes climate better or worse. We just don't know. If we have an ammonia spill in the ocean, we do not know if it turns into N2O, which is a substantial greenhouse thing, or would contribute to eutrophication. We don't actually know the answer to that. So there's a scientific effort to be done as well as a technical development effort around some of these environmental issues. I don't think that they are going to be deal breakers. I don't think that they're going to look that bad. Again, we have an existing ammonia industry, but boy, we should take that stuff seriously. A recent paper by PNNL suggested that it could be quite bad. We had issues with that paper in terms of their methodology, in terms of their findings, but it raised the issue broadly, and we think that's important to understand better. Colin, to you.
Yeah, I'll extend that to the air quality issue. So we know a lot about the chemistry of ammonia in interacting with NOx and SOx to form particulates, but there's a lot we don't know. One of the conclusions of a deeper research agenda on this might be what regions it's smart and not smart to do increased use of and transport of ammonia, depending on which part of that atmospheric chemistry is currently the limiting reagent. That may have implications for locations where we do and don't want to use ammonia. So I also want to add another comment. There have been many questions about ammonia as storage. We've talked about using ammonia directly, cracking it back to hydrogen. I also think that remains an open set of questions. Do we want to crack ammonia back to hydrogen and run it through an existing PEM fuel cell when we offload it? Do we want to try to develop direct ammonia combustion, ammonia fuel cells? The logistics of this and optimizing that broad energy system is still poorly understood and will depend strongly on many, many local factors. And I apologize, I want to add one more comment, which is we need to be thoughtful both about the carbon intensity of the electricity supply for electrolytic hydrogen ammonia production and any leakage that may occur of upstream methane and potentially hydrogen when we look at the blue ammonia approaches. So the full life cycle needs to be thought about very carefully here.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, we could keep on going for a long time, but we are out of time. And at the Center on Global Energy Policy, we start on time and we end on time. I want to thank our speakers here, Julio Friedman, Colin McCormick, and Catherine Mers, and Fanji Wan. Also thank Carla Arjela and the entire events team at CEGEP for pulling this together, and thank all of you for joining us. We really appreciate it. We had almost 100 questions come in. We're sorry we weren't able to get to more of them. But thank you for joining. The link for our report is in the chat. Please go, you could just Google ICEF Low-Carbon Ammonia Roadmap and you'll find it. And the next CEGEP event is going to be on the energy system in Nigeria on February 15th. Please join us for that. Thank you very much for joining us today. All the best.
Thank you.
Goodbye, everyone.